It is past midnight on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, somewhere along a river called the Danube, in the year 172. Snow is falling on a leather tent. Inside, by the light of a single oil lamp, a man in his 50s sits on a low camp stool. He is not eating. He is not sleeping. He is writing, in Greek, in his own hand, on a small private scroll that no general, no senator, and no soldier outside the tent will ever be allowed to read. You would expect this man to be a scribe. A minor officer. Someone with time to kill. He is the Emperor of Rome. He commands more soldiers than any human being alive. He rules more land than any man in the history of the world up to that point, from the fog of Britain to the deserts of Syria. And on this particular night, in this particular tent, with a war outside that could end his empire and a body that is already failing him, he picks up his pen and writes a single sentence to no one but himself, that the mind which is free from passion is a fortress, and no one can storm a fortress from the outside. Stay with me, because this is not a story about an ancient book. This is not a story about a dead religion. This is not a story about men in togas arguing in a garden. This is a story about a man who had everything, and was still afraid, and what he did with that fear, alone, at night, when no one was watching. His name was Marcus Aurelius. And tonight, you are going to understand exactly why he was terrified, and exactly what he did about it. Here's what most people miss about Marcus Aurelius: he did not want the job. He was born into a wealthy Roman family, adopted as a teenager into the imperial household by the Emperor Antoninus Pius, and groomed, whether he liked it or not, to inherit the largest empire on earth. He liked philosophy. He liked quiet rooms and difficult books. What he got instead was war, plague, betrayal, and the slow public collapse of everyone he loved. You have to picture him honestly. Not the marble statue on the horse. A man with a weak stomach, chronic chest pain, and, according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, who lived through part of his reign, a body that was simply not strong enough for the life he'd been handed. Dio, writing as a senator who watched Rome from the inside, said that Marcus never got the good fortune he deserved, because he spent almost his entire reign buried in one crisis after another. And then Dio added something you don't expect from a Roman senator: he admired Marcus more because of it. Not despite the suffering. Because of how Marcus carried it. That's the story tonight. Not a man without fear. A man who built a discipline around his fear so it never got to drive. The Stoics, the school of philosophy Marcus had studied since he was a boy, had a word for the daily practice at the center of all of this. They called it prosoke. Attention. Not motivational poster attention. A brutal, minute-by-minute habit of catching your own thoughts the second they appear, before they turn into panic, before they turn into rage, before they turn into despair. Marcus Aurelius practiced this every single night of his adult life, in a private notebook that had no title, no chapter headings, and, this is the part that should stop you, no signature. He never once wrote his own name in it. We'll come back to that. Keep it in the back of your mind. The first crisis is the one that put him in that tent on the Danube in the first place. In the year 166, tribes from across the northern frontier, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, entire confederations of Germanic peoples Rome had spent a century holding at arm's length, broke through. They didn't just raid a border town. They pushed deep into Roman territory, all the way into northern Italy, closer to Rome than any invading army had come in nearly 300 years. Marcus was not a soldier. He was a philosopher emperor who had spent his life reading Epictetus, not commanding legions. And now he had to leave Rome, leave the libraries, leave everything familiar, and go live in a military camp on a frozen river for most of the next decade of his life, personally directing a war he never wanted, against enemies who did not care one bit that he'd rather be reading. Here's where it gets remarkable. In 172, during the campaign against the Quadi, an entire Roman legion, the 12th, nicknamed the Thundering Legion, got surrounded. No water. No way out. Surrounded on all sides in brutal heat, watching their own men collapse from thirst, hours from total annihilation. And then, according to Cassius Dio, a sudden violent storm broke over the battlefield, soaking the parched legion, terrifying the enemy, turning near disaster into a Roman victory so strange that it got carved onto a marble column back in Rome, and different peoples immediately fought over who to credit for the miracle. You don't need to believe in miracles to understand what that night meant to the man watching it from command. Marcus Aurelius spent years of his life this close to catastrophe. Not once. Over and over. War is not a metaphor in this story, it is the room he lived in for a decade. And this is where the philosophy stops being theory and starts being survival gear. There's a Stoic idea Marcus leaned on constantly, and it's not what people assume Stoicism means. Stoicism does not mean feel nothing. The Greek word is apatheia, and it does not mean numbness. It means freedom from the kind of passion that hijacks your judgment. Not, stop feeling fear. Feel the fear. Notice it. And then don't let it write your next decision for you. Picture Marcus in that tent again. He is not writing, "I am not afraid." He is writing the opposite. He is writing down, honestly, in private, that events themselves are neutral, a storm, an invasion, a fever, and that the only thing a person actually controls is the judgment they attach to it. Not the war. His response to the war. That's the entire discipline. That's prosoke in practice: catch the thought, examine the thought, decide whether the thought deserves to run your body. But it gets stranger. Because the next crisis Marcus faced wasn't a foreign army at all. It was someone he trusted. In 175, in the middle of the northern campaign, a rumor reached the eastern provinces that Marcus Aurelius had died. A general named Avidius Cassius, a brilliant, battle-tested governor of Syria who had won real victories for Rome in the east, believed the rumor, or used it as cover, and declared himself the new emperor. Half the Eastern Empire recognized him within days. Marcus, very much alive, now faced the one threat every Roman emperor feared more than any barbarian tribe: civil war, launched by his own general, backed by his own soldiers. Think about what that does to a person. Not a stranger betraying you. A man you promoted. A man you trusted with an entire half of your empire, deciding the moment your back was turned that your throne was his for the taking. Before Marcus could even reach the east to confront him, Cassius was assassinated by his own officers, men who apparently decided the revolt wasn't worth the risk once the dead emperor turned out to be very alive and marching toward them with an army. Here's what most people miss about what happened next. Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't order mass executions. According to multiple ancient sources, he showed clemency toward Cassius's family and supporters, an almost unheard-of response for a Roman emperor who had just survived an attempted coup. He is recorded as having said he wished he could have spoken with Cassius directly, to reason with him, rather than see him killed at all. This is not weakness. This is autarkia in motion, a self-sufficiency so complete that another man's betrayal simply could not reach the part of Marcus that decided who he was going to be. He did not need Avidius Cassius's death to feel secure. His sense of himself did not depend on revenge. Hold that thought, because it's about to be tested again, this time, somewhere Stoicism can't reach with a philosophy lecture. It's about to be tested at home. Marcus was married to a woman named Faustina the Younger, daughter of the previous emperor, mother of at least 13 children with Marcus over their 30-year marriage, only a handful of whom survived childhood. Rome was not gentle with infant mortality, even for an emperor's family. Contemporary gossip was not kind to Faustina. Cassius Dio himself repeats rumors that she had affairs with soldiers and gladiators. You will never find a word of that suspicion in Marcus's own private notebook. What you find instead is gratitude. He describes her, in his own words, as devoted, warm, and without pretense. Whatever the truth of the rumors, in his private thoughts, meant for no reader at all, he chose to remember his wife with tenderness, not resentment. In 175, not long after the Avidius Cassius crisis, Faustina died, likely somewhere in Cappadocia, far from Rome, possibly while accompanying Marcus east to deal with the aftermath of the revolt. He had her deified. He built a foundation in her name to support orphaned Roman girls. And then he went back to work, back to the frontier, back to the war that never seemed to actually end. This is not a story about a man who never grieved. This is not a story about a man who suppressed every feeling behind a marble mask. This is a story about a man who grieved and still had an empire to run the next morning, and used the same private discipline, the same nightly notebook, to hold both things at once. There's one more thing you need to understand before we get to the ending, because it's the part almost nobody talks about, and it's the part that makes everything else make sense. Marcus Aurelius's private notebook, the one historians eventually titled Meditations, centuries after his death, was never meant to leave that tent. It has no dedication. It has no introduction explaining who he was or why he was writing. It jumps between topics with no order, repeats the same handful of ideas over and over, the way a man talks to himself when he's trying to convince himself of something one more time before sleep. And critically, nowhere in the entire text does Marcus Aurelius write his own name. This is the detail we planted at the start of this video. Now here's the resolution. He didn't sign it because he wasn't writing it for you. He wasn't writing it for history. He wasn't writing it to be remembered as wise. He was a sick, exhausted, grieving man in a war tent, using a pen the same way you might use a late-night voice memo to yourself, not for an audience, not for a legacy, but because saying the thought out loud, even just to a scroll, was the only thing standing between him and losing his nerve completely. Think about that the next time you write something at 11 at night that you'd never post anywhere. Think about that the next time you talk yourself down off a bad thought alone in your own room, with no one else in the building. You are doing, right now, in your own life, the exact same thing the most powerful man in the ancient world did, night after night, for years, on a frozen river at the edge of an empire that was slowly falling apart around him. That is the modern bridge. It's not a metaphor. It's the same behavior, 2,000 years apart. By the final years of his reign, Marcus was fighting on multiple fronts at once, the war in the north dragging into its second decade, a devastating plague sweeping through the empire that may have killed his own co-emperor years earlier, and his own health finally giving out. He brought his son Commodus onto the frontier with him during these last campaigns, hoping to prepare him to rule. History remembers Commodus as one of Rome's worst emperors, a brutal disappointment to everything his father tried to build. Marcus never lived to see that failure. He died in the field, near the Danube, in the year 180, still commanding a war he'd spent almost his entire reign trying to end. This is not a story about a number of years he ruled. This is not a story about how many battles he won. This is not a story about an empire's borders on a map. This is a story about a man who never once got to put the notebook down, and used it anyway, every single night, until the night he simply stopped writing. So here is what you actually take from this. First, Stoicism was never about feeling nothing. Marcus Aurelius felt fear, grief, and betrayal as intensely as any of us. The discipline was never in avoiding the feeling. It was in the half-second between the feeling and the decision, the prosoke, the attention, where he chose what happened next. Second, the people who look the most in control are very often the most quietly terrified. Power did not protect Marcus Aurelius from a single one of his crises. What protected him was a private, unglamorous habit, writing down the truth to himself, alone, with no audience, night after night, for years. And third, this is the one I want you to sit with. Marcus Aurelius never wrote his notebook to be read. He never signed it. He never expected a single other person on earth to open that scroll. And yet here you are, nearly 1900 years later, still listening to a dead emperor's private late-night thoughts. Because he was honest enough with himself in the dark that the honesty outlived the empire, outlived the war, outlived his own son, and outlived Rome itself. You don't need a throne to do what he did. You just need a page, and the willingness to tell yourself the truth on it. Which one of Marcus Aurelius's crises hit you the hardest tonight, the war, the betrayal, or the grief? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if a Roman emperor could sit alone in a war tent and turn his worst nights into the most read philosophy book in human history, the least you can do is hit subscribe before you go, because next time, we're going back into another mind that turned its darkest hour into something the whole world still reads. I'll see you there.